Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is the second session of Mishnah in Depth, Avodah Zara with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. This class is a pre-recorded session in lieu of meeting at our normal time. Our Mishnah in Depth is sponsored in part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is in her memory with care by her family. This class is assuming that students are studying Avodah Zara on the Mishnah Yomit schedule, 1 to 2 mishnayot a day, and we're coming together about once a week to discuss, review, dive in depth, and a bit more. For this chunk, we have the pleasure of having Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who is the faculty advisor for teen programs at Drisha, and we're always great to have her back. With that, I'm going to hand things over to her.
All right, hi everyone. Welcome back. So this week we learned the second parak of Avodah Zara in the Mishnah. And I think there's a lot there that's sort of familiar to people who keep what we would call kosher. Like the Mishnah doesn't see it all as kosher laws, which is also in and of itself very interesting. You know, like when we walk through the world, we call all Jewish dietary restrictions kosher. But actually, when you're learning your way through the Mishnah, there's no like Masachet Kashrut. And in fact, Masachet Machshirin, which might sound the most likely, has very little to do with things that we today eat or don't eat, and has a lot to do with water falling on fruit. But our parak was a lot about foods that we eat and we don't eat based on Avodah Zara considerations. And kind of the kosher keeper knows this in the sense that like we talk a lot about like Chalav Yisrael and do you keep it? Do you not keep it? But all of a sudden you realize like it's much more expansive laws than even are still in observance today, which is like kind of wild. So today we're going to talk about the history of the prohibition on Gentile oil, which already within the Mishnah itself gets revoked, which is like kind of crazy, right? There's like, oh yes, they did this and it's gone already by within the Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to tell the story of that. I think it's actually really interesting, or like the debates about the stories. We're going to see two possible stories within the Bavli, another one, the Yerushalmi. We're going to open Sefer Daniel. Like, how often do you get to do that in a Mishnah class? I know, Sefer Daniel is so great. So we're going to do that. But before we do that, so some of you know, if you've been learning with me at Drisha here and there, I'm very interested in all things like pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding. So I'm gonna hold. There is some breastfeeding in our parak. I'm gonna hold myself back from that topic. If we have time at the end, we'll turn to it. But I don't think we're gonna have time, if I'm being honest. But I did want to talk about OBGYNs, because our Mishnah has a prohibition on Jewish women being OBs for Gentile women. And that's obviously so counter to the like, everyone go be a doctor kind of like Jewish vibe today. And in fact, if you were to like Google, like, can Jewish women be OBGYNs? The only thing you would find is like, yes, it's amazing, of course, da, 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 da. And you would find no reference to our Mishnah. So like what happens? What happens to our Mishnah? And in order to really understand this, also, like one of the things that's interesting that's going on here is that you have a real bifurcation between the role of Me'aladet and the role of Rofeh. And people who know really anything about this know something of the history of how midwifery got like absorbed into the medical establishment. But for most of human history, those were different things, which really makes sense, right? Because pregnant women are not sick and laboring women are not sick. The issue is that so many things can go wrong during pregnancy and labor that then do require like a sickness type of intervention, or at least the tools that a hospital has, let alone the possibility for just for infection with like a home birth, for example, that we've now sort of the medical establishment and what was seen at the time and now sort of also as a sort of misogynist I don't know, like advertising crusade against midwives and against home births, like absorbed this whole practice into hospitals and into hospital births. And just like put my cards on the table, I'm a big fan of hospital births. I think they're for sure, especially in the United States where there's not really medical support, and in some states it's even illegal to have, so far as you can like legislate natural bodily processes, have home births. But at the same time, like it is important to recognize that in the Mishnah, the discussion about midwifery is like totally separate and different from discussions of doctors. And we're gonna see it and how that plays out like within sources. So that's sort of something that caught my attention when I was learning, and just wanted to share more on that with you. So here's our Mishnah. There's like a whole bunch of other stuff in this Mishnah. I'm sure you learned it already, but here's just the zooming in on the part that I'm interested in. So, Ba Yisrael lo te'alid et hanokrit mimnei shemi'alad et ban la'avodah zara. So, a Jewish woman may not deliver the child of a Gentile woman because in doing so, she's delivering a child who will engage in idol worshiper, and idol worship, who will grow up to become an idol worshiper. Aval nochrit mi'alad et ba Yisrael. But you're allowed to have a Gentile woman deliver the child of a Jewish woman. So, this sort of does that interesting thing where it's like for us, it's all about saving our own lives. And this is sort of something you see play out in a number of places, like one of the core places is Masach Yoma, where like pikuach nafesh for us. And not necessarily pikuach nefesh for everyone. And then there's sort of a move within the Gemara and later sources to say, actually, maybe we need to like expand this vision or else things are going to go really badly for us. And we're going to see that really play out immediately here in source number 2 of Avodah Zara 26a. So the Gemara says, hold on, we have a countervailing Breita, or me to contrast the Mishnah with the following Breita. Yudit mi'aledet aranit b'schar v'lo b'chinam. So the Breita says a Jewish woman can deliver the child of an Aramean woman or any Gentile woman in exchange for payment, but not for free. So that's already sort of weird. Like, why is it about payment? Why not for free? Maybe for free, the Avodah Zarah concerns still exist. Like, you shouldn't just be volunteering to like bring an idolater in the world, but like once there's something in it for you, then you're not doing it for the purposes of bringing an idolater into the world. You're doing it for the purposes of making money, which again is like really strange and kind of perverse sounding. But here's how Rav Yosef explains it. Amar Rav Yosef, b'schar shari mishum eva. If they're paying you, then you're allowed to do it because otherwise there would be eva, there would be enmity. So in order to be able to get along with our neighbors, once they're paying you, you have to do it. And it's not about Avodah Zarah, not Avodah Zarah, you making money, you not making money. It's about we need to live peacefully in this world, and therefore you have to deliver their babies if they're going to pay you for your skills. And it continues, Rav Yosef's opinion, or like the Stam interprets Rav Yosef's opinion. Savar Rav Yosef Lamima, Rav Yosef thought to say, Olode nochrit b'Shabbat b'schar share mishum eva. So all of a sudden, right, the Mishnah has nothing to do with Shabbat. The Mishnah is just like, there's an Avodah Zarah concern with delivering a non-Jewish baby into the world any day of the week. Right? It's not like, oh yes, on Mondays you're allowed to do Avodah Zarah, but like on Shabbos, no Avodah Zarah for you, right? Like no, Avodah Zarah doesn't care about Shabbos, or like doesn't care about Monday, whatever. And all of a sudden we now have a Shabbos concern that Rav Yosef is adding in. Yeah, actually, not only are you allowed to deliver their babies for in exchange for pay, you're allowed to deliver their babies even on Shabbos, Mishum Eva, says Rav Yosef. And Abaye says, Amarle Abaye, hold on, you could say to her, Didan diminatre shabda mechalinan alayhu, didhu de lo minatre shabda lo mechalinan. Maybe the concern, Abaye's argument is about the Mishum Eva thing, about the enmity. You can make an argument that a Gentile will understand if you make yourself unavailable on Shabbat. Oh, I would deliver a Jewish Shabbat observant mom on Shabbos, but like you guys don't observe Shabbat, go find someone else, right? Like I think that's more or less what Abaye is suggesting. And so Abaye is sort of saying, no, Shabbat is our like amazing carve out of an opportunity to one day a week, we don't have to deliver babies for Avodah Zara. Kind of seems to be Abaye's argument, because you can tell them something that they will understand, and then they won't be mad at you for not birthing a baby into Avodah Zara on Shabbos. So Abaye is saying, it's really interesting, I think. Like, Abaye is saying they understand that you keep Shabbat. You can't tell a Gentile, I will not birth your baby because they will grow up to be an idolater. They could never understand that. They would hate you for saying that. But they are respectful of your Shabbat observance. And so just blame it on Shabbos, says Abaye, then they won't hate you. And really, but for Abaye, it doesn't seem to be a Shabbos concern. It's like using Shabbat as an excuse to get out of having to deliver a baby to a Gentile. Okay, so we're gonna look at Rashi and Tosfot on this. So Rashi says, okay, we actually kind of talked about what Rashi says, but Rashi says about Rav Yosef's like svara, like the Stam's extrapolation on Rav Yosef, where he says it's a permitted in exchange for payment because of enmity, right? That it's mishum eva, and Rashi just extrapolates on Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef really, in the Savar of Yosef Lamimar, he doesn't say anything about weekdays. Rashi just doesn't want you to think that, like, oh yeah, Rav Yosef thinks you can only deliver their babies on Shabbos, Mishum Eva. No, just as on a week, just right, Shabbos, you can also, right, Shabbos, you can also deliver their babies just as on a weekday. Kivachol, Mishum Eva, and because of enmity. And what's that enmity? Like, what's the nature of that enmity? It says Rashi, Tahainu Chazi Dimiyaldin Lanashe Didan B'Shabbat Kivachol, because they see that that the Jewish midwives deliver Jewish babies on Shabbat and weekdays, and if we don't deliver their babies on Shabbat and weekdays, they'll get mad and they'll have enmity, and they'll be Eva. And so Rashi explains Rav Yosef's opinion. They're gonna see that our midwives are working, so they have to work also for Gentiles. And Abaye says, no, maybe you could say it. And this is probably where Rashi like gets this interpretation of Rav Yosef, right? Abaye says, no, you have an excuse to not deliver Gentile babies on Shabbos, like use it, and they won't be mad at you. Okay, so then Tosfot comes in on the whole delivering babies on Shabbos thing. So he says, Tosfot says, Tamil Rav Yosef. I have a question about Rav Yosef. So the that because he thinks that it's permitted. Abaye nami, and Abaye also seems to think it's permitted to deliver Gentile babies on Shabbos. The Mishani deleka Eva, because he's only teaching that like maybe there's a way to get out of the enmity, but mashma ha'ika Eva. But what that comes to show you is that in a case where there is enmity, Share, then actually, like, you're allowed to deliver their babies. So the concern of Mishum Eva, that concern of there'll be enmity, does override Shabbat. The question is only, like, can you, like, get around it somehow? And Rav Yosef says no, and Abaye says yes. Like, that seems to be the debate. But no one's debating that Mishum Eva overrides Shabbat. So that's really the Tosfot's question. How is it possible that this idea of Mishum Eva, that this idea that there'll be enmity, can override something that is a Torah level prohibition on Shabbat? So, okay, then you're like, hold up, back up. What is the Torah level prohibition? I can see a lot of like secondary Torah level prohibitions about birthing and delivering a baby on Shabbat. Maybe you're cutting the cord or something that would be prohibited, but like maybe someone else could do that, you know? Maybe you're like traveling or you're carrying things or you're heating water, like all of those things. But Tosfot's about to say that the literally midwifery, like the actual delivery of a baby, Tosfot's assumption here is an Isur D'Oraita on Shabbat, which is just like fascinating. So here's what it is. He brings it from Parak Shmona Shratim, which is in Shabbat. And it's talking about birthing an animal. Someone who reaches his hands into the innards of an animal on Shabbat, and you detach a fetus that's in his womb, you're obligated, you're chayav on Shabbat, so if you did it, well, 5 different things depending on your level of intentionality, I guess. But you violated Shabbat in a Torah level because you detached something from its place of growth. Dehu toda degozes, and that is a subcategory of shearing, right? So like hair on a sheep used to grow, you cut it off, you've detached it from its place of growth. So too a fetus from the womb, which is like a wild idea, first of all, about how active, like as if like the midwife is like cutting the baby out, which again, like maybe if it's like a C-section or like forceps or vacuum or whatever, then it sort of is, right? Like we're pulling it out of this place where like it doesn't want to come out. Even though maybe it needs to, and even though maybe it's injuring or killing mom, right? Okay, but you're still, from the fetus's perspective, this is my place. I'm comfy in here. I don't want to leave. And you're being dragged out from the place that you were flourishing in. That's gozies, apparently, which is just amazing. So how could it be that Mishum Eva, this idea, this concern for enmity, would override a Torah level prohibition? That seems nuts. Asks Tosfot. So Tosfot gives the following answer, two potential answers. Yeshomar dahacha b'yoshevet al mashber shekfar ne'ekar. Let's see. So the Tosfot says 2 things. One, once she's already sitting on the birthing stool, it's already like separated itself, like it's ready to go. So it's ready to go out. You're not separating it from anything. Inami kivan dekalo chodashav pasku gidulo. Or once it has reached full term, it has stopped growing. So like you're not detaching it from its place of growth because like the growth isn't happening anymore. That's Tosfot's idea, at least. We kind of know that that's not the case, and it keeps growing, and that's actually why it gets more and more dangerous. Like after full term, the longer you carry the baby, the bigger it gets and the more dangerous the delivery is, right? So we know that it still is growing. But the idea that like once mom is in such heavy labor that it has already separated itself, like that's interesting. Like I think that's, I mean, whatever, it's all interesting, right? But like that feels very compelling, that like then what is delivering? It's coming out on its own. You're just catching it, which is really the language that some people are starting to use now, which is like mom delivered the baby, you know, like the midwife just like was there to make sure it all kind of went well and caught it. But she, she's not the one doing the work. Mom and the fetus and nature are doing the work. Anyways, okay. So that is most of what I have here, but I just thought there's this tshuva of the Rashba. The Rashba is a student of the Ramban. They're sitting in Spain. The Ramban is a doctor, and he gets this amazing question that I just wanted to share with you. So, Sha'alda od Rofei Yisrael, Mahu la'asot refuah lenochri kadei shetita berolo. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's this pretty strong distinction between midwifery and being a doctor for the majority of human history. Like it's really, really modern that like OB is a medical doctor. But the Rashba gets a question of like, how closely are these two things connected? And actually, well, let's read it and then we'll see like how closely he thinks that midwifery and doctoring are connected. So, and we're like in the Middle Ages in Spain, okay? Sha'alta od Rofei Yisrael. So you asked another question, whenever this is a correspondence between someone. Rofei Yisrael, mahu la'asot refuah lenochri kadei shetita berolo. So is a Jewish doctor allowed to do medicine for Gentile women so that she'll get pregnant? Are you allowed to be a fertility doctor? Which is interesting, right? That somehow that's different than midwifery. That's refuah. Like she is her inability to get pregnant is sickness, or her infertility is sickness requiring refuah, requiring healing. So the questioner says, "Midami lahadatznan ba Yisrael lo tialid anochri b'nation megedalet ban Avodah Zara olo." Is it similar to that which is taught in the Mishnah that a Jewish woman should not deliver a Gentile woman because she raises a child to Avodah Zara, or is it not similar? Okay, so then Here's the answer, tshuva. Right, so but the real question is, are fertility doctors and midwives the same? Are doctors and midwives the same? Do the prohibitions of midwives apply to doctors? Okay, I just think it's so interesting and exciting. All right, so here's the answer, tshuva. So first of all, even for a midwife, we conclude that if she's being paid, then she's permitted due to enmity. The Garcinan Hatan, because we teach over there, i.e. in the Torah, Ba Yisrael lo tzili de Nochri, or Minhu Yehudit Mi'alad Aramit B'schar v'lo b'chinam. Right, so we bring the Mishnah, and then the Breita that says a Jewish woman is allowed to deliver an Aramean woman for money, but not for free. And then he brings Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yosef, V'schar Shari Mishum Eva, who explains the Breita that with for a fee it's permitted due to enmity. And here's what the Rashba says: V'kol shekin rofeh shemerapela kol. How much more so a doctor? He heals everyone. V'im ino merapatan havile. And if he doesn't, right, the doctor, his job is to heal everyone. If he doesn't heal someone, there's especially going to be enmity. So if there's enmity for the midwife, how much more so is there enmity for the doctor? Like all the reasoning, right? So are midwives and doctors the same? No, it doesn't really seem like it. But the reasoning about a midwife gets a kol shekin onto the doctor. Like how much more so this applies to a midwife? For sure, how much more so should this apply to a doctor? Okay. Okay. V'ani ra'iti, now we get story time. V'ani ra'iti et harav Rabbeinu Moshe Bar Nachman, and I saw the rabbi Rabbi Moshe Bar Nachman, aka the Ramban, Shanit Asik v'Moachazu Etzel Hanochri B'schar, who is engaged in work like this for a Gentile woman for pay. So cool. The Ramban was a fertility doctor. Anyways, okay, I just think that's awesome. So are midwives and doctors the same? No, but you can learn one from the next. And therefore, all of the permissions to override our Mishnah that exist within our Gemara and in later sources, for midwives today, also apply to any kind of doctor that's dealing in fertility. You're allowed to support Gentile birth, basically, as a or idolater birth, let's say more specifically, idolater birth. And the Ramban himself did it with his hands, which I think is just like awesome. And awesome that like his students were there part of it, like they saw him, like, yes, I saw the Ramban like provide fertility medical support to someone, to a Gentile woman. Like, I don't know, I just feel like that's really cool. Okay, so that is as far as I'm going to take things on the question of delivering babies to idolaters. The next thing I want to move over to is Gentile oil. Totally different topic. Welcome to the Mishnah series with me. I just picked stuff that I think is interesting and do little deep dives, and they don't all connect because like just a parak of a shiur, okay? I think just one like sort of larger point that I want to say is that the parak does really hang together on this like food front, and it seems like the midwifery thing is not related, but I think where you go thematically is the midwifery thing is related to breast milk, and breast milk is in fact food, and there you get into giving Jewish babies to Gentile wet nurses, and allowing Jewish babies to drink like non-Jewish milk. Which I just want to flag, like there's a lot of texts against, even like relatively modern, right? Like the Aruch HaShulchan is anti, the Ben Ish Chai is anti. The Aruch HaShulchan literally blames like he blames like people growing up and going and like becoming secular and like going into like bad culture on their exposure to Gentile breast milk as babies, which is like nuts. But maybe what he means is like you have these Gentile women breastfeeding your babies in your home, and like that's the problem possibly for him. I don't know exactly. In any event, right, this concern that like my baby should only get kosher milk from like a very young age, it takes its root in our parent, and I think that's how you get the midwifery stuff kind of rolled in, because those two feel inherently connected, and then it sort of like grows from there. from and it gets included here because of the breast milk hook into all the other food considerations in our parak. Okay, so oh, sorry. And the one thing I want to flag about that is just that even though our parak has all these concerns, in other places in Shas already you have, if the baby needs this food, even though it's not kosher, it's allowed to eat it. So just wanted to flag that as an important thing for everyone to know. And I'm always happy to answer questions like that privately, depending on people's specific circumstances. But you do see, right? Like you see specifically like Chalav Yisrael or like kosher or formula, whatever stuff like that, it exists in the market. And some of that is coming out of exactly the concerns that are raised in our parak. But no one would say like, oh my gosh, my preemie can only get like Jewish breast milk and I don't want them getting some non-Jewish breast milk. And it's okay if they die. Like, no, it's not okay. Like, okay. Just putting that out there. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Gentile oil. So here's our Mishnah. Iludrim shel goyim asurim ve'ein isuran isur hana'ah. So these are items that come from Gentiles or belong to Gentiles, and they're prohibited, but their prohibition is, it says it in the negative. It's easier to understand it in the positive. You are allowed to get benefit from them. So you're not allowed to eat them potentially, but you're still allowed maybe to like sell them for money, or I don't know, like if it's oil, like apply it to your face or whatever, right? Like you're allowed to do other stuff with them that brings you, or like, right, like they were anointing all day long, right? So you are allowed to do that. You're just not allowed maybe to eat it. So here's the list. Chalav shechalavo goy, so milk that was milked by a Gentile, ve'ein Yisrael ro'ehu, and a Jew wasn't there watching, so that's non-Chalav Yisrael milk, v'habhat, and bread, v'hashemen shalahem, and oil. But already, right, of that list, bread, milk, bread, and oil, Rabbi Ubeitino Hitir b'shemen, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his court already permitted the oil of Gentiles. Okay, so oil of Gentiles. So the Gemara is going to trace it back to Daniel, but I want us, before we get to the Gemara, to take a look at Daniel inside, and then we will, when we get to the Gemara, we'll have seen the Daniel stuff that it's talking about. Okay, so we are in a time where Yechonia Melech Yehuda has been exiled, and they're starting to loot basically the community at the very, very end, like towards the destruction of the first temple. And the king Nebuchadnezzar says to Ashpenaz Rab Sarisav, the king orders this guy Ashpenaz, who's his chief officer, להביא מבני ישראל ומזרע המלוכה ומן הפרטמים ילדים אשר אין בהם קומום וטובי מראה ומשכילים בכל חוכמה ויודעי דעת ומבינים מדע ואשר כוח בהם לעמוד בהיכל המלך וללמדם ספר ולשון כסתים. So the king orders his chief officer to bring Israelites of royal descent and nobility, kids, youths, who are like perfect and amazing, right? No blemish, handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable and intelligent, capable of serving in the royal palace, and teach them the language of the Chaldeans. Okay? And the king allotted to them rations, pat bag hamelech umiyen mishtav, from his food and from his wine. Ulgadlam shanim shalosh, and they would be raised for 3 years. Umiktatam yamdu lifnei hamelech, and at the end of that time, they would enter into the king's service. So this is like the story of how these Jewish boys end up in the Babylonian king's palace. And importantly, we've already flagged, here's the food that they're going to eat. So they're going to get bread and wine, or food and wine, right? Pot bag, right? So pot also, like, it doesn't, nowadays we translate pot and lechem, by the way, as meaning just bread, but that's not originally what they mean. They mean just food, and food is sort of like symbolized by bread. Okay, So here, who is it? Vehi behemi b'nei Yehuda, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So among them were the Judahites, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. V'yasim sarisim shemot, and they get these Babylonian names. V'yasim leDaniel Belshazzar, leChananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, leAzariah Eved Nego. So they get all these names. Daniel becomes Belshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, Azariah Abednego. V'yasim Daniel al libo asher lo yitzga'al bepat ba'al kamelech u'v'yin mishtav. And Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. V'vakesh misar hasar yisim asher lo yitzga'al. And he requested from the chief's officer that he shouldn't have to defile himself with this food. V'yitena Elohim et Daniel l'chasad u'l'rach mi'im lifnei Sarah hasar yisim. And God, did the opposite of what Hashem did to Pharaoh, right? So in this case, Hashem disposed the officer to be kind and compassionate towards Daniel. V'yomer Sarah sarisim Daniel. So the chief said to Daniel, Yarei ani et Adoni hamalach, I'm afraid of the king, asher mina et ma'achalchem ve'mishnechem, who allotted food and drink to you. Asher lama you're at penechem zoafim minei yeladim asher kigilchem, because you'll notice that you'll look out of sorts and you'll look different than the other children of your age. V'chiyavtem et roshi lamelech, and you will, I'll owe my head to the king, is the literal translation there. And so Daniel says, Vayomer Daniel el ha-meltzar. Also, this is where the word meltzar, as in waiter in modern Hebrew, comes from. So Daniel says to the meltzar, the guard, but in your head you can say waiter. Asher mina Sarah sarisim al Daniel Hananiah Mishael Azariah. So Daniel replied to the guard who was in charge of him. Nasna at Avodah yamim asara, test your servants for 10 days. Ve'nulanu minha zeroim ve'nochla umayim nishtat. Give us legumes to eat, water to drink. V'yir'u lefanecha mar'inu umar'a yeladim hochlim et pat bag hamelech. And then you'll compare. So you'll look at us and you'll compare our appearance with the other kids who eat the king's food. And whatever you see, like that's what that you'll do as you see fit based on that. So they agreed to the test, the davar hazeh, v'nasim yamim asara, and they test them out for 10 days. V'miktzat yamim asara nir'em mar'ehem tov. And when the 10 days were over, they looked better. And and they looked healthier than all of the children who were eating the king's food. So they convinced their officers, and the guard removed their food and the wine that they were supposed to drink, and he gave them all legumes. And God made all four of them intelligent, proficient in writings and wisdom, and Daniel had understandings of vision and dreams of all kinds. So when we're thinking about where do these prohibitions on Gentile foods even come from, this text is like an amazing example of it. Now, you read this text and you did not see oil in it. You saw bread and wine, which, by the way, are the other, or well, we haven't seen, wine is in our Mishnah, but not here. Milk, bread, and oil are the things that are grouped in our Mishnah. Wine gets a much more extensive treatment, but bread and wine are two of the things that do appear in our parak. And oil, like, how would you get oil from this story in Sefer Daniel? But at the same time, if you were looking for a text that's all about not eating fancy Gentile food and instead just eating legumes, or like seeds might be another translation, right, of what they're eating, zaronim, then maybe this would be a great place to find it, right? Like there's something about this Gentile food that Daniel, seemingly a little kid, by the way, like a not yet educated, but very bright and promising little kid, seems to have this intuition almost about. But again, Daniel's intuitions, are they prophetic? Are they just like a little kid being super machmir? Hard to say exactly. So, but he says, yeah, I'm not eating this. And it's clearly about like this belonged to the king and I shouldn't eat like king food, right? And we get these standards for Gentile foods. Like one of the Bishul Akum, the like food cooked by Gentile standards is Olal Shulchan Malachim, like would go on the king's table. Like this is where that comes from, right? Like Daniel refusing to eat the food that was literally on the king's table, and instead saying, "I'll eat worse food. I'll eat the legumes. I'll eat animal feed potentially. I'll eat the seeds, instead." And that being something that sets him apart, takes him outside of the king's sphere of influence as directly, right? Like, what is the point? It's not just the like health thing is not why Daniel does it. He's not like, oh, I'll be healthier than all these other kids because I'm eating seeds. Like, that's not what it's about for him. It's an act of rebellion, an act of resistance, an act of identity protection. I'm different and I have to eat different food. I don't just like sit at your table and eat your food and become you. No, I'm refusing even though I have to be here, right? Daniel's effectively enslaved. Like it sounds so nice. Oh, they will take all these really smart children who are perfect in all these ways, and we will educate them into our culture, and then they will go into the service of the king. Like that's just called abduction, you know? Like and human history is full of stories like this. You know, especially in North America, like in America and in Canada, we loved abducting children and sending them off to boarding school and then teaching them our language and not letting them teach the language they grew up in and making them eat our food and not letting them eat the food that they grew up in and hoping that they'll grow up to like serve our type of people instead of their own type of people, right? Like our type of people. So that's 100% what the story is. Like it sounds so fun, like, oh yes, like Daniel got to grow up in the palace and eat the fancy food. Like that's not what this is about. And that's not what's happening here. Don't be fooled. And so he uses the like food prohibitions or food restrictions as a way of keeping himself separate and apart. And that clearly gets rewarded not only sort of like physically, but also in spiritual potential, right? So not only does he gain the type of knowledge that the king was hoping for him to gain, right? Madavas gal b'kol sefer v'chochma, but also Daniel Hivin b'kol chazon b'chalamot, and that seems to be especially what Hashem gave him, that gift that Hashem gave him because he intuitively kept his food separate. So I think this story is like the really like driving story behind like a lot of the food separation things that we see happening in the Mishnayot in our parak. But the Gemara is going to particularly connect it to oil. And we're going to see how that happens. So the Gemara quotes our Mishnah, Vashem and Shalham, and their oil. So Shaman, Rav Amar, Daniel Gazar Alav. So Rav says Daniel decreed that oil is prohibited. Shmuel Amar, no, is Lifatan Shal Kalim Tmeim Osartam. Shmuel says no, it's much more technical. It's about the secretion of ritually impure vessels into the oil. So the oil, right? If a Gentile makes oil and puts it in their vessel, that vessel is going to give off ritual impurity into the oil, and that's why we can't use the oil. And then the Rav says back to Shmuel, Atu kule alma ochle taro ninu. Seriously, you're worried about impurities? Like what, everyone is a Kohen who only eats pure stuff? Like that can't be what this is about. Okay, so no, that's not what I meant. Fatan shel kelim asurin osartam. Okay, there's stuff in the walls of the vessels that is actually prohibited, like basar chalav or nevela or bugs or whatever, all kinds of prohibited foods that are in the walls of the vessels that are going to get secreted into the oil. It's not about tuma, it's about iser, right? So we've changed categories, but same general argument. Amr Shmuel Rav, so Shmuel says back to Rav, Bishlama lididi, Aminas lifatan shalkin masurin osartan. Hainu dichiat Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta va'amar Darish Rabbi Simai ben Nitzivin Shaman Rabbi Yudo beitzino nimnu alav veitziru kasavar notin tam lifgam mutar. So Shmuel says to Rav, listen, here's the problem. The problem is that this got rolled back, right? So whatever you say the original prohibition is based on has to be something that can be rolled back. So if I think it's about the secretions of non-kosher flavors into the oil, then you can understand a world where when Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marta came and said that Rabbi Simlai taught in Nitzivin that Rabbi Yehuda and his Beit Din decided to permit oil, they could do that based on svara. They could do that based on a reasoning, and that reasoning is notin tam lifka mutar, that even though there are secretions into the oil, those secretions are not delicious. They don't add to the oil. They make the oil worse. You wish they weren't there. Maybe they're rotten. Maybe they've been in they left the vessel sitting for a day or something like that, whatever, a million things that makes the secretions undesirable or rotten. It gives off a bad flavor, and therefore it's permitted, even though it's technically has its origin in something that is prohibited, because it's not adding in a positive way, it's permitted, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda Nasi could declare that Gentile oil is permitted. So if it's about the secretions into the oil, I can understand how reasonable people could disagree and how, based on logic, it could get overturned. But in your opinion, you say that Daniel made this determination. Daniel Gazar va'ata Rabbi Yehuda Nasi mevatali. Daniel makes it a decree, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes along and overturns it. That's not. Don't we have a Mishnah in Idiyot that says, "Ein Beit Din yachol levatal divrei Beit Din lechavero, elim ken gadol imenu b'chachma v'minyan." We have a Mishnah that says a Beit Din cannot overturn the words of its fellow Beit Din unless it is greater than it, both in wisdom and in number. And how is it possible that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi held greater wisdom and number than Daniel? Not possible. How could it have been? If it's not about logic and it's just about authority, there's no way that this got overturned. The story doesn't make any sense. So now Rav is gonna bring some like kind of technical disproofs. Like he's gonna say, oh wait, you're talking about Rabbi Simlai of Lod? Amar le Simlai Luda Kamar Shani Ludai the Mizalzalu. Wait, was it Rabbi Simlai of Lod who you talked about? Residents of Lod are different. They disparage the sage's decrees. Rabbi Simlai's testimony is unreliable. But then that's like Rav's response. But Shmuel says, okay, you think he's unreliable? Let's talk to him. Ashlachle, should I go call him? Like something amazing is happening here, which is like Rav and Shmuel are learning about the overturning of the prohibition of oil, kind of like in real time as it's happening, it seems like. So they're like, right, you get this whole Masorah here, right? That Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marta comes and says Rabbi Simlai teaches that this was overturned, which is like wild. Like, okay, it's being overturned in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav and Shmuel are reacting to it in Bavel, and that's sort of the narrative that we're getting right here. And it seems like Shmuel is immediately like, yep, this totally makes sense to me, and Rav is like, yeah, this like doesn't make sense. And I don't trust Rabbi Simlai who says that this is what happened. But then Shmuel says, okay, should we call for Rabbi Simlai? And then Rav is embarrassed. So Amarav, Imhem lo darshu, Anan lo darshinan. If Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in his court did not expound the verse, will we expound it? It says in Daniel, which we saw this, but Daniel like put in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the yayin mishitav bishtei mishnayot hakatuv b'daber, with two types of drinks is what the verse is talking about. Echad mishnah yayin ve'echad mishnah shaman. So where do we see it in Daniel? We see it from mishtav in the plural, wine and oil. Rav Savar, so Rav says, let me tell you how it's possible that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi walked it back. Al libo sam, which is in fact what it says, right? Vayasim Daniel al libo. Daniel made this decision for himself. He was really from L'kol Yisrael hora. so Rav says, yeah, he made it for himself, but he also then taught it to all Jews. Ushmal Savar Ali Bosam Lo Kol Yisrael Lo Hora. And Shmuel says, yeah, he determined this for himself, and he didn't teach it to everyone. And then the Gemara goes on to say, hold on, is it actually true? Shem and Daniel Gazar, did it actually come from Daniel? Va'amar bale avimi nidva mishmei derav pitan ushamnan yinan uvnoteam kula mishmonasar davarhen. Hold on, this isn't from Daniel. This is from the like 18 matter. So we have that this one day, this one like famous day in the history of Jewish decrees, and their bread, the prohibition on their bread and their oil and their wine are all in that list when all the students of Hillel and Shammai, like they were like the most rabbis ever in a room together, and this is one of those things that they decreed. So maybe you'll say, Ata Daniel Gazar velo kibul. So Daniel came and he made the decree, but it wasn't accepted. Va'atu Talmidei Hillel v'Shammai gzor v'kibul. But the students of Hillel and Shammai came along and people accepted it. So Im Kain ma ashadute de Rav. So who cares about like Rav's testimony that Daniel instituted it? Ella Daniel Gazar lav be'ir va'atu inhu ugazor afilu basada. Rather, Daniel made this decree to apply in the cities, like where the population density is higher. Maybe oil is even like actually trickier to come by in a certain way, but it's more important because you're surrounded by Gentiles. Atu inu gazor afilu basadan. And others came along and said, or the students of Hillel and Shammai came along and they said, no, even in the field. Okay, but you're left with still the same question. Rabbi Yudana see Hichimatzi L'Mishrei Takanta to Talmidei Shammai the Hillel. Rabbi Yudana see how is he allowed to permit an ordinance issued by Hillel and Shammai? And right, we quote our same Gemara again from Idiot, right? That a Beit Din is only allowed to overturn rulings if they are greater than the original ruling Beit Din, both in wisdom and in number. And furthermore, like anything made as one of those 18 decrees, you're not allowed to overturn, because we have this statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Bati Din are allowed to nullify each other's rulings, chutz mishmonasar davar, other than these 18 things. Shafil yavo Eliyahu beitino in shomimo. Even if Eliyahu and Navi came, we wouldn't overturn these 18 things. So how are we possibly allowed to overturn the prohibition on Gentile oil? Okay, so here's the answer, and I think the answer is cool. Amar Rav Misharshia, so Rav Misharshia says, my time, what is the reason why these 18 things are not allowed to be voided? Hoyo ufashat Yisrael barov Yisrael, because the prohibitions that were declared on that day were accepted by the majority of Jews. Here's the thing. Shemen lo pashadi suro barov Yisrael. Why? The oil, this never happened with. The Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Yeshvu Rabutinu Ubad Kual Shemen Shalo pashadi suro barov Yisrael. They actually did research and they checked around and they said, no one's actually keeping this. V'samchu Rabutinu al divrei Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel ve'al divrei Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok shayu omrim, and they relied on the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and on the opinion of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, and they used to say ein gozrin gzeira latzibor elin kim rova tzibor yichli la'amud, that we don't make a decree for the community unless we think the majority of the community can actually do it. The Amar, okay, and then we bring a pasuk from Malachi. And okay, fine, let's stop here with that. But like an amazing thing, I think this line is amazing. And the whole thing is amazing, right? Because it seems like the ruling, the idea that you shouldn't make a rule that people will be able to uphold is like, before you make the rule, you should do the research and find out whether people can uphold it. And in this case, and then if the answer is no, then not make the rule. In this case, it seems like they made the rule, even at the super high level. Either Daniel instituted it or Hillel and the students of Hillel and Shammai instituted it, along with a slew of 17 other rules that are really, really strong and upheld. And then later they were like, awkward, no one's doing this. And they rolled it back. on the premise that you can't actually make a decree that people aren't going to be able to uphold. So from the evidence that they collected that people weren't upholding it, they determined that it should never have been made in the first place, because clearly that it was a decree that people couldn't uphold. And so then they were able to undo it. That's the argument here. So there's like we've seen a few different things happening here. I just want to run through a short list of them because it's like a very kind of convoluted Gemara in a certain way, because there's a lot happening. It seems like Rav and Shmuel hear about the fact that this rule about oil got rolled back, and Shmuel is an immediate acceptor. He's like, yep, this makes total sense. Let me tell you why. And Rav is like, I hate this. It doesn't make any sense. I don't accept. Push back, push back, push back. The Gemara itself wants to accept it and therefore pushes back against Rav by offering, hold on, maybe it wasn't actually Daniel, but then within that back and forth, in a way, makes it worse, right? Okay, maybe it wasn't Daniel, maybe it was the students of Hillel and Shammai. Okay, but even Eliyahu and Navi has to abide by those rulings of Hillel and Shammai, and eventually they come to a way to understand, okay, it was Daniel, it seems like in the end, right? It was Daniel for people in cities. Hillel and Shammai made the decree for people in the fields. But none of this was actually made in a way such that people were actually ever doing it. And from the fact that when people were never doing it, we can roll it back, which is just like astonishing history of halacha to see playing out within the Gemara. I just think that's really cool. And also just to back up some of these reads. Okay, first of all, sorry, before we get there, but we're gonna look at the Yerushalmi right now in the last couple of minutes here. We get another reading about why it got rolled back in the Yerushalmi. So who permitted it? Rabbi Hitzira Ubeitino, like Rabbi Danasi and his Beitin. Why? So here's one thing that appears in the Yerushalmi that doesn't appear in the Bavli. So Rabbi Acha, Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chia b'Shem Rabbi Chanina v'Amrila b'Shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi shayu olim lahar hamelech v'neragim alav. They were climbing up the king's mountain and were killed about it. So what does that mean? So in order to so Pnei Moshe suggests the commentary Pnei Moshe, and there's a few different commentaries on the Yerushalmi that have different interpretations here. What is clear is this Neharagin alav. So right in the Bavli, it's all about like no one was actually observing this. Here it's that in order to observe it, in order to get access to olives to make their own olive oil, they were dying for it. And that's how the Pnei Moshe understands it. For sure, someone's dying, right? Right. So why were they able to roll it back? They were putting themselves in danger of they were going up to the mountain of the king to collect olives, and they were being killed for doing so. So therefore they rolled back the prohibition on oil, because getting access to oil that was not being made by Gentiles was just too hard. Like they didn't have their own types of access. And I do think that that's also really interesting and in a way really relevant. Like in order to make your own grapes, like you need grapevines, but grapevines don't take like generations to grow before they fruit, right? Like olive trees take a really long time to grow. And what that means is like if you're in exile and you can only have olive oil if it's from your own trees that are growing in your own home, or like in Jewishly owned land that's being passed down generation to generation, then you're just not going to have olive oil. Like you just like the idea that there's going to be enough olives grown on Jewish owned land when you're a diasporic nation is just not realistic. And so then you have people like saying like, okay, we have to press our own olives. We're going to go like steal olives. Like, I don't know exactly what the story is, but they're endangering themselves in order to get oil, in order to get olives to make oil. Like that's pretty intense. And I think it really sheds light on the differences between some of these other products, which are mobile, or you can plant them in one season and they grow, or grapes, it's like a few seasons. versus olives, which is like, that's a really long-term kind of commitment. And if you are being kicked out of your property all the time, then you don't have access to it in that same way. Okay, the other thing I want to point out in the Yerushalmi here that I just thought was really interesting. So we have the same story about Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta Nachal in Nitzivim. That's exactly the same place, by the way, as we saw in the Bavli. Ashkach Simlai Hadromi Yati Vidarash, and he comes across Rabbi Simlai, who's sitting and teaching, and here's what he's teaching. Rabbi Ubeitzino Itir B'Shemen, Amar Shmuel Aval. Rav lo kibel le mechol. Sorry, Rav lo kibel le. Rav lo kibel le mechol. So Shmuel says, yeah, great, I accept. And Rav is like, absolutely not. I'm not eating Gentile oil, which is really lines up with what we saw in the Bavli. Like the Bavli is this whole complicated sugya, but here in the Yerushalmi, it's really simple. They hear about it. Shmuel is an immediate adopter, and Rav is like, no. And then Shmuel says to him, Amr le Shmuel achol. Shmuel says to Rav, go eat it. Because if you don't eat it, I'm going to tell everyone you're a Zake Mamre who doesn't listen to Rabbi Yudanasi. Which is like also amazing, like the back and forth, almost like banter between Rav and Shmuel. In the Bavli, you had it a little bit different, right? The Bavli, you had Rav being a doubter and Shmuel being like, okay, should we call Rabbi Simlai? And Rav being like, oh, okay, fine. And like backing off. And here he says it's more intense, right? I'm going to call you a Zaki mom, right? Amar le, okay, like I'm just trying to figure out, okay, it's 1 minute. So I'll just, they go back and forth a little bit. And then eventually, this is just the best line. Right? Shmuel just keeps bothering Rav until eventually he gives in, which is like, if you're ever looking for like a great text about like rabbinic will, halachic way, I feel like this is one of them. Like this idea that like Rav and Shmuel disagree, and Shmuel just keeps bothering Rav until he gives in and is like, all right, I'll consume the Gentile oil. Yeah. And then you have, and then the last thing I'll just point out here is that you have this exact same idea that but put into different words about a Zara she'ena tzibor yichlal amud ba, that they also, right, like you have this idea that a Beit Din shouldn't make a decree that people can't upkeep, but it's phrased differently. So here I just want to show you that quickly. Shekol gzera shebitin gozrin ve'ein rova tzibor mekablin aleiham eina gzera. So here it's actually phrased differently. It's a Beit Din makes the gzera, but people don't accept it. Right? It's stated explicitly. If a Beit Din makes a gzera, but most people never end up accepting it, then it's simply not a gzera at all. Like a gzera is actually a two-step dance. A Beit Din makes it, and the people accept it, then it becomes a gzera. Badku matu b'gzera toshel shaman, and they looked and they checked about the gzera of wine, v'lo matu shekiblu rova tzibur aleim, and they found that people did not actually accept it, and so therefore it was never actually made, because it's a two-step thing. It's a gzera and people accepting it, not just Beit Din makes a gzera and that's it, which is almost like the opposite of what had been previously in the Yerushalmi, where Shmuel says to Rav, like, they made this gzera, go eat it, or else I'm going to call you a Zaki Mamre, right? Like, that's the, like, authoritarian direction, like, they said it, this is now the halacha, versus the prohibition on oil, which is like, they said it, no one actually ever kept it, therefore, it doesn't matter what they said, because it never actually became a gzera, which is just, like, the whole thing is, like, wild also, because just to, like, take a step back to our Mishnah for a second, I'll go back to it, right? The Mishnah tells this very simple story, right? This is a list of things that are prohibited. Oh, by the way, Rabbi Ubeitino permitted the oil. And both Gemaras, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, in similar but also different ways, are like, what the heck does this mean? Who prohibited it? Who permitted it? Why was it prohibited? Why was it then permitted? And how, and like, what is authority? And that's what it really cuts to, is this like, what is authority? And Shmuel in the Bavli offers this really straightforward thing. Yeah, they had one halachic opinion, but Rebbe says it's about Tam Lifgam, totally different halachic opinion. That becomes the winning logic. So okay, the logic changed. A basic opinion on this that was a premise of this was found to be not true, so we undid the whole thing. That's one option. Another option is they tried this and it just completely failed from the outset. So now we're just gonna like tell the truth about it and walk it back on that failure. And then there's the third option, which is the Rav option of like, I hate this. This is from Danya. Like, we should keep this. And everyone being like, so sorry, Rav, like you lost. Which is just wild. So anyways, I was glad we got to look at that. Obviously, there's so much more to say about this, and if we had more time, we could have like really picked this, especially the Bavli, apart into pieces, organized it chronologically, like really seen all the different stuff that's happening there. So it'd be a great sugya for that. And if anyone wants to do that on their own in their free time, I'm happy to check your work. Yeah, but for now, we will stop here.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Rabbanit Leah, for today's class. And I hope that we are all able to learn together in person the following week. Take care.
Have a
Chodesh
meaningful
and Chodesh Tov.